What is the saddest thing you've ever seen? My squadron commander in the Air Force, in the late 1970s, was a young female captain. One afternoon, her husband was killed when his F-4 jet fighter crashed during a training exercise. But for about an hour, she could not be reached. She was deliberating at a court-martial. I saw her return, park her car, walk into the building with her normal cheery gait, innocent and oblivious to the terrible news she would hear in less than a minute. Edit, a clarification. I was not the one to deliver the tragic news. The wing commander delivers the news in these circumstances, an all too familiar routine. During my 4 years assigned to that wing, there were 10 fatalities in training accidents.
It's tough to imagine going through something like that while trying to keep it together. The way she walked in, not knowing what was about to hit her, shows how surreal life can be. Just being in the military, you've got to deal with all the unexpected. It's wild how life can change in a moment, especially in such a high-pressure environment. People carry on, but those moments definitely stick with you.
One of my friends died in high school. He was only 16. He got into a car accident, swerved into soft sand, and overcorrected. We all knew his mom very well because she was very involved in school activities. When we went to his wake and was standing by his casket, strong as could be, smiling and shaking everyone's hand as they knelt down at the casket and paid their quiet respects. She maintained this demeanor until the very end of the funeral, when they were carrying the casket out to the hearse, and she threw herself over the casket, sobbing like only a mother who's lost a child can sob, and screamed, "My baby's in there, my baby boy," and fell to her knees and just broke. It absolutely killed me.
That's really tough to hear. Losing someone that young is hard, especially when their family is so connected to the community. It's always surprising to see how people cope differently, holding it together for so long, then breaking down when reality hits. Moments like that stick with you, and it's a reminder of how fragile life can be. It's a pain that doesn't really go away.
My mom always keeps my brother's phone plugged in and charging. It's always on the desk next to his bed. My brother passed away in January. Every time I come home from college to see the family, she will always tell me about how it lit up and that it had to be a sign from him that he is checking in on her. Just the thought of my mom sitting on his bed looking at his phone through welled-up eyes, not sure if they are tears of grief or happiness that she thinks he's still there somehow. It crushes me. I miss him so much.
That's tough. Losing someone is never easy. It must be hard for your mom to feel that connection, even if it's just a phone lighting up. The way she sees it might help her cope, but I can imagine how it hits you. It's a reminder of the void he left behind. You've got to take care of yourself too while you navigate these feelings. Missing him is normal.
My family fosters dogs until they get adopted, but some never do, so we look after them as a sort of unofficial family. They're usually old, quiet, and don't shower you with affection like other dogs. They just ignore you until they hear food clanging in their bowls. But every time one gets to that age where they stop eating and walking, they start to notice you. When you come home, to find them sliding in their own filth, and they just look up at you in disappointment. Or when they're shaking and whining and just want to see a familiar face. My parents take them to the vet, along with a flower they like to smell, or a toy they might have carried around once before losing interest. When my parents get back, my dad just turns on the TV as normal. My mom gives him a hug, hugs me, and walks up the stairs in silence. She spends the next few months telling us that was the last one we're going to take care of, but there's always another call. We've had our current foster for a year now.
It's tough to see those dogs get old and frail. They seem indifferent until they need you the most. The sadness hits when they know their time is up. It's a strange routine, dealing with loss, but it becomes part of life. I guess it's about finding comfort in the little moments shared, even if they don't shower you with love. Each call for another foster just shows the bond we have with them.
It's never easy losing a close childhood friend. What was harder was telling my mom. We had known this kid since I was about 9 years old, and my mother was his SAT tutor. I remember walking in the house somberly, and she immediately knew something was wrong. When I told her that Justin died, the horrifying screech/cry she let out is still burned into my memory. She dropped the laundry basket on my foot and hugged me harder than I've ever been hugged while tears poured profusely. She pretty much watched this kid grow up with me and treated him like a son, making it that much harder to break the news to her. When she went to call his parents, I went to my room and cried like never before. I fortunately can't think of a sadder time for me.
Losing a close friend is tough. It hits even harder when you have to break the news to someone else who cared. I remember when I told my mom about Justin. She knew immediately that something was wrong. Her reaction hit me hard. I just sat in my room afterward, feeling completely overwhelmed. It's not an easy memory, but it's one that sticks with you. Grief is complicated that way.
When I was 15, I was in the hospital, and I had to watch my doctor tell the man across the hall that his 6-year-old son had just died. The man just stood there holding the boy's teddy bear and crying and saying, "That's my son, my son." I didn't realize the boy had died until last year. I'm 22 now, when my friend who was our nurse at the time slipped up and told me one night when we were drinking.
That sounds really heavy. It's tough to see something like that as a kid. The idea of being so close to something so tragic leaves a mark. It must have been hard to process it all back then, especially not realizing the full weight of what happened until years later. It's a reminder of how fragile life is and how we sometimes don't fully grasp situations until we're older.
Was driving and saw a homeless guy on a bike cross the street at a point too high on a curb. He had also tied a grocery cart full of recycled cans and bottles to the back of his bike. Both lost their balance and fell into the middle of the street, a big dramatic straight out of a cartoon fall. He got up and tried grabbing a bunch of the stuff, but it was all over in the street and he was blocking it, so he didn't get much before he grabbed his bike and his cart and pedaled off. It was devastating seeing someone's livelihood literally dumped into the street like that. I cried for a long time afterwards. My heart broke for that dude.
That's a tough scene to witness. It really shows how fragile things can be for some people. I remember a similar moment when I saw someone struggling to keep their things together after losing their home. It stuck with me for a while. It's easy to forget that everyone's fighting their own battles, and sometimes situations can go south real quick. Seeing someone's hard work scattered like that hits hard.
Seeing two squirrels crossing the road, and one gets run over. The other makes it across, then realizes its partner didn't. It scurried back out to look at its slain partner, seeming really super sad and remorseful for a few minutes before scurrying off, climbing a tree, and going about its squirrel business. Life is so fleeting.
That's a tough moment to witness. Animals can show surprising depth of feeling. It's just a reminder of how quickly things can change. The squirrel seemed to understand loss in its own way, and then it found a way to move on. Kind of reflects how we deal with grief too, doesn't it? Just have to keep going even after something heavy. Life really is brief.
That video of Jack Black spending a day with a homeless kid in the slums of a country I can't recall at the moment. The kid so desperately wants out of his situation, and Jack Black so desperately wants to pull him out of that situation, but there's nothing in that moment he can do. That moment is the saddest thing for me, because that moment isn't over. That kid and millions of kids like him struggle for basic human necessity every single minute of the day.
It's tough to see someone in a bad situation and genuinely wanting to help but feeling powerless. Those moments hit hard, especially knowing it's a reality for so many kids. You can feel the weight of despair and helplessness. It's just a reminder of how different lives can be and how important it is to help when we can, however small the effort might seem.
The reason I quit a job was an RTM for a rent-to-own type company went out on a scheduled repo voluntary pickup because my CRM was off that day. 4-year-old kid, and the pickup was for bunk beds and a Wii. Imagine that kid crying and asking his mommy why the people were taking his Christmas present away. Now go home and try to look at yourself in the mirror. I took my 5 weeks of unused vacation and found a new job. I will never forget that little guy.
That sounds really tough. It's hard to see kids get upset like that, especially over something they cherish. It makes you reconsider what you're doing for a living. Quitting for your own peace of mind is understandable. That little guy's reaction probably stuck with you and made you realize what really matters. Finding a new job was a good move. Sometimes you gotta do what's right for you.
I've seen a dog get hit by a car, then waited for the owner after we called them and watched him come to the realization that his dog was dying in the middle of the street. Unfortunately, had to see a person's heart break right in front of me. Right there I swore I would do everything in my power to make sure no dog or pet ever got hit by a car if I had a chance to stop it from happening. I have saved 2 dogs' lives since.
That sounds like a really tough experience. It's hard to see that kind of pain. Losing a pet can hit really deep. It's good to hear that you've been able to save a couple of dogs since then. It shows that you're doing something positive, even after witnessing that. It's all about making a difference where you can. Pretty commendable for sure.
My dad's face when he told me his sister had passed away. I was very close to my aunt, and it was a sudden, unexpected death. I can still remember my dad's exact words when he told me. It's one of the only times I've ever seen him cry. To see how broken he was in that moment is truly the saddest thing I've ever seen.
I remember when my dad told me about my aunt's passing. It hit hard because we were close. Seeing him break down like that was something I'll never forget. It reminded me how life can change in an instant and the impact of loss. Moments like those really stick with you, and it makes you appreciate the time you have with loved ones. Just a tough day for us all.
Lost my Nana a few years ago. She was the ripe young age of 62. My granddad is the friendliest person I can think of. I've never seen him lose his temper or get angry, and he's always making people laugh. He's a typical northeastern steel worker, hard as a nail, and doesn't show his emotions. Seeing him walk up to the coffin and throw the holy water over it was gut-wrenching. He was trying everything to hold back his tears, but you could see his world was shattered. I should add, his wife was everything. He threw away the chance to play for Leeds United in the 60s because she couldn't go with him. This was when Leeds were the best team in the country. They said he could have been another George Best.
That's a heavy story. Losing someone close is tough, especially when you see a strong person like your granddad show such raw emotion. It's wild to think how choices shape our lives. He gave up a career for love, and that kind of bond is rare. Seeing him say goodbye must have been heartbreaking. Turns out, those quiet types can feel deeply, even if they don't show it.
I was pet sitting for a friend. They had a couple of dogs and cats, and it was clear the dogs got more attention, and the cats were outside only. One of the cats was kind of odd-looking calico pattern, but very odd markings, so it wasn't the cutest thing. It was clear it didn't get much attention. One night, I let the cat in to sleep with me, and it was so happy and cuddly. For the next few days, I did the same thing. I would let the cat in at bedtime, and the cat couldn't have been more content when sleeping with me. On the day I left, I went to say goodbye to the cats. When I closed the sliding glass door on it, it looked up at me with this sad and confused face that just broke my heart. That was something like 20 years ago, and I still see the poor thing's face to this day. Getting dust in my eye just thinking about it.
That sounds like a memorable experience. It's interesting how pets can form connections, even when we think they're overlooked. That cat probably felt a kind of warmth it hadn't experienced before. It's funny how a small gesture like letting it sleep with you made such an impact. That image of its sad face at goodbye really sticks with you. It just shows how much love we can share, even in short moments.
I'll always clearly remember when my dad told me that my cousin had died. He was very young, 27 at the time. He and my family were close. He wasn't amazingly close with his immediate family, and hadn't been for a while, so he used to spend Christmas, etc. with us. He had a lot of problems, and after several failed attempts, killed himself. It was a shock since it had been quite a while since he had last tried anything and genuinely seemed in a much better place around that time. But it'll haunt me to this day watching my dad, a stoic, usually pretty emotionless guy, come up bawling his eyes out, muttering to himself how he'd finally done it over and over. The first time in my life that my dad seemed vulnerable.
That's a heavy story. It's hard to see someone you care about struggle like that. Losing a cousin is tough, especially when you were close. Watching your dad break down must have been a lot to take in. It's strange how grief can reveal sides of people we don't usually see. Moments like that stick with you and change your perspective on life and relationships. It's a stark reminder of vulnerability.
I worked at a Dunkin' Donuts in high school. An old man and woman would come in every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon and get 4 cake ring donuts and coffee. They always asked about how school was going and how I was doing in baseball and so on. Then they'd sit down and just talk with each other over their donuts and coffee. They stopped coming in for a couple weeks, and I, of course, was worried. One day, the old man came in alone. He ordered 2 donuts and sat down at their table alone, just staring at the donuts with the saddest face. It was heartbreaking.
That's tough to see. Something about regulars makes you feel connected. The old couple sounds like they had a routine that brought them joy. When he came in alone, it must have been a reminder of what was lost. You get to see small snippets of people's lives like that, and it can hit hard when things change. It's part of the reason why places like that matter.
This will likely get buried, but it has stuck with me for years. I worked in a theme park and sometimes dealt with lost children. There was a boy who was around 15 years old who looked upset, but desperate to hide how freaked out he was. As I get to talking with him, he kept repeating that his mother left him. I tried to assure him that she was probably looking for him, but he insisted that she left him all alone, that she was probably out with her friends, or that she forgot about him. He said that she had done it before. He was trying so hard not to cry, but it was really a lost cause. I had to leave him in our customer relations area because we didn't have a procedure for children over 13 being separated, as they were considered adult enough. It was just overall a disheartening experience. It's not the same level as death or tragedy of that nature, but God. Seeing someone have no hope that their mother loves them enough to remember them while being in a place surrounded by happy families was awful. I hope that kid has people who care about him enough to tell him that they do.
That's tough to hear. I can imagine how hard it must have been for that kid to feel so alone in such a cheerful place. Not having a clear way to help him just adds to the frustration. Kids need support in those moments, and it's sad when adults can't see their struggles. You hope he found some people who truly care about him later on. It's a reminder that everyone has their own battles.
I was 7 years old, 15 years ago. I was asleep one morning around maybe 6 a.m. I awoke to a scream the likes of which I had never and will never hear again. The sound of a grown man screaming in pure agony and pain. My father had left for work early, at which point my mother received a call that my brother, 24, had died the night before in a motorcycle accident. She called my father's cell and told him to come home. Once he was home, she informed him that their son had died. That scream haunts me to this day.
That's a heavy story. It's crazy how some moments stick with you forever. Losing someone close, especially in a sudden way, can create a lasting impact. It's hard to wrap your head around such intense emotions at a young age. I can't imagine what your family went through that day or how it shaped your life. It sounds like it was a turning point for everyone involved.
Seeing my grandfather in the hospital, so many tubes going in him just to keep him breathing. The sound he made whenever he breathed made me so sad. The last time I saw him, I told him I loved him and that he was the greatest person I've ever known. I couldn't see him again. All those tubes, the beeping, the sound of him breathing just made me sad. He died the day after I told him I loved him. He was awesome, always made sure me and my brothers were happy, no matter what. To make things sadder, he died 10 days before my birthday. It's sad knowing that it's already going to be 3 years since he passed. 3 years since I saw him, smiling even with everything going through him. Rest in peace, Abuelito. I love you. I wish you didn't go the way you did.
It's tough to see someone you love in that condition. The sounds and all the tubes can really hit hard. It's good you told him how you felt. Losing him just before your birthday adds another layer of sadness. Time passes, but memories stay. It's clear he meant a lot to you and your brothers. Just holding on to the good times can help. Rest in peace to your abuelito.
Seeing my grandmother after she had a stroke laying in her hospital bed. She had very strict orders in her living will not to have any life-prolonging measures if the doctor said chances for recovery were slim. She was at a world-class facility, but the head neurosurgeon wasn't available until Monday. This happened on a Friday night. And the doctor was a bit strange and wouldn't let anyone else make the call, so my grandma was there for 2 days waiting. I had just seen my grandma a week before in seemingly great health, and I had a card to give to her, a thank you note for a gift she had given me. And I didn't give it to her then, because I was supposed to see her on Saturday. Seeing her like that, and realizing I would never talk to her again, crushed me.
It's tough seeing someone you love in that state, especially when you just saw them healthy. The waiting must have felt surreal, not knowing what would happen next. You had that card, which makes it even harder knowing you missed that moment. It's a heavy reminder of how quickly things can change. Grief is complicated, especially when there are unresolved things left hanging. It's just one of those things we don't really prepare for.
My great-aunt married in her late 30s and never had children. She is seriously one of the sweetest ladies I have ever known. When her husband Brownie, really his name, I'm not racist I swear, died, we all attended the funeral, and she held it together until the preacher started to wrap it up. At that point, you hear my great-aunt start choking back sobs, and then she just says, "You know what?" That was the point when everyone started bawling. She did okay for the first month without him, and then it all fell apart. She stopped eating or drinking. She hit 75 pounds before we were able to force her into a nursing home where they put her on a feeding tube that she would rip out unless she was restrained. She died 5 years later. TLDR, my great-aunt became a widow and lost the will to live.
That's a tough story. It's sad to see someone struggle so much after losing a partner. Sometimes people just can't cope with the absence, no matter how strong they seem at first. It's wild how quickly things can change. She was sweet, but losing Brownie hit her hard. The feeding tube situation sounds rough too. Just a reminder of how important support is during tough times. Life can be unfair like that.
When I was a hospice nurse, about sunrise, I got a call that a patient had died and went out to perform the death visit. When I got to the home, an elderly black gentleman met me at the door. He was so calm when he told me his son was in the bedroom. I walked in and saw the son lying there, bathed, in clean pajamas with a silver dollar over each eye. The son was all the father had. He had died the night before, and he had spent the next 7 hours getting him ready before he called me. I performed hundreds of death visits, but this one still breaks my heart thinking about that father's long last night with his son. I can still see those silver dollars.
That story really hits hard. It shows the depth of love and care in those final moments. It's tough to imagine the pain that father went through, taking the time to prepare his son. Those little details, like the silver dollars, make it all the more real. It sticks with you, even after so many experiences. You can't help but feel for him and the bond they shared. Just a really powerful moment.
My best friend after her brain injury. One man's bad decision to drink and drive ended up taking everything away from her. She was so vibrant and full of potential before the wreck. Afterwards, she had forgotten everything. We had to teach her how to eat, walk, talk, and potty train her again. It's been almost 9 years since her accident, and things just aren't the same. She's like a ghost of her former self. She only has the mentality of a 12-year-old. Every time I see her, it rips out my heart. You miss her tremendously.
It's tough to see a friend go through something like that. The change is massive, and it's hard to accept how much things have shifted. You remember the person they used to be, and now it's a different reality. Helping her with the basics must be exhausting, but at least you're there for her. Living with that kind of loss leaves a deep mark. It's a reminder of how fragile life really is.
I interned at the Superconducting Super Collider in Waxahachie, Texas, the summer of 1993. It was an amazing environment and was designed at startup to be higher energy than the Large Hadron Collider is today. An incredible mix of scientists and engineers from all over the world who had moved their families to Bumblefuck, TX to be a part of the next frontier in particle physics. Early in the summer, there were rumblings that Congress was cracking down on the budget for the project. One afternoon, every last person in the facility, minus me, I had a deadline, stayed in my cube, went to the auditorium to watch a live C-SPAN broadcast of a congressional budget vote. 30 minutes later, an endless, perfectly silent line of scientists, engineers, programmers, and administrators filed past my cube, eyes on the carpet. Congress had killed the whole project.
That summer at the Superconducting Super Collider must have been intense. Watching the excitement, and then the shift in mood when the budget was cut is something else. It's wild how passionate people were about their work, and then just like that, it all changed. I can imagine the atmosphere in the building after the vote. Deserted halls and everyone just processing what happened. A tough moment for a lot of dedicated folks.
My mom's aunt died a few weeks ago, who we'll call Kay. I never knew Kay too well because she was very old and didn't speak English well. Also, she lived 8,000 miles away from my home. Kay died while we were on vacation, and we went to the funeral. There were people there that I didn't know. At the cremation center, everyone was in the viewing room while we watched as the casket headed toward the incinerator. It was quiet in the room until one lady burst out, "Goodbye, Mommy, have a safe trip." Everyone else started crying, and people started shouting their goodbyes. There were inaudible shouts because they were muffled by sobs. People I did know that were crying who I've never seen cry. It was also the first time I went to a funeral. The whole situation was just too sad for me.
That sounds really intense. Funerals can hit hard, especially when you're not used to that kind of situation. It's tough when emotions run high. Seeing people you know in pain can really change how you feel about things. I guess it can be a moment of realization about family and loss, even if you didn't know Kay well. It's just a heavy experience all around.
I moved from Iowa to Oregon to be with my ex. It was hard adjusting to not having anyone besides him around, and to deal with it I would take a lot of walks around our area, as our apartment complex had a beautiful property. One time it was very lightly raining, and I was already kind of sad and lonely, but as I was walking through the grounds of our apartment complex, I looked through the chain link fence that borders our neighbors' personal yards. There I saw an old man that I saw every day, taking his dog outside for exercise or to go potty. That day, though, he was not taking his dog out for exercise or to eliminate. That day he was burying his dead dog. Edit. Phrasing.
That sounds pretty tough. Moving to a new place and feeling lonely can hit hard. I can imagine how seeing that old man bury his dog must have added to the sadness. It's a rough moment, reminding you of loss while you're dealing with your own loneliness. Sometimes we find connections in unexpected places, but those moments can also feel heavy. It's okay to feel that way.
I went to an amusement park, and I was in line for the biggest ride there. When you were about to go on the ride, you sat in the seat, and one of the ride workers would push down a restraint that would be over your hips and waist. This rather large man came onto the ride with his friends. His friend sat down in the seat, and the restraint was put comfortably over them. But this ride worker tried to push the restraint down on the large man, and it wouldn't fit, it would just bounce back up. The ride worker pushed hard as he could, but it wouldn't click and stay over the man. So he had to get off the ride while his friend stayed on and had a blast. He had such a look of shame and embarrassment on his face. I felt so bad for him.
I've seen something like that before. This one time at a fair, a friend of mine jumped on a ride, and the same thing happened. The attendant was struggling to get the bar down, and it just wouldn't budge. My friend looked so uncomfortable, and eventually, he had to leave the ride too. It's tough to watch something like that, especially when you know they just wanted to have fun with the group.
Always late to these threads, but hey, race mine. Back around this time in 2010, my dad was somewhat blindsided by cancer. I say that because his symptoms were similar to needing his gallbladder removed, but instead he had esophageal cancer that restricted even water going down completely. For people who don't really know, it's an incredibly aggressive cancer that shows no signs until it's in stage 4. I sat outside the hospital with my dad while he was having a cigarette, and he said, "I always wondered what I would look like old. I guess this is it." I will never forget that for some reason, and it kind of bothers me when people complain about getting old, because not everyone is granted that luxury of seeing every stage of their kid's life. He only lived 7 months later. He just turned 54 that year, and I was 17. Still not completely over it.
That's a heavy story. It's tough losing a parent, especially at a young age. Seeing your dad's perspective on aging while facing something so serious is a lot to process. It makes you rethink how people talk about growing older and all the little frustrations that come with it. I get why it still sticks with you. That kind of experience leaves a mark. You don't really get over it, just learn to carry it with you.
There was a little boy who got separated from his mom in our store. We paged her for half an hour, and there was no answer. The kid, who was about maybe 10, said to us in the saddest little kid voice possible, "She's probably with her kids." We finally found her dicking around on her phone in an aisle. We decided to go around asking every single lady we could find. She comes up to the front where the boy was, and he's relieved, so he runs to her for a hug. She just straight up denied him and continued texting and shopping. Maybe it isn't the saddest thing, but I still wonder about that kid sometimes.
That's a pretty tough moment for that kid. Imagine thinking your mom is lost and then finding her, only for her to brush you off. It makes you wonder what's going on in her mind. Kids need that reassurance, especially during a moment like that. I hope he got what he needed from someone else. It's easy to forget how much a simple hug can mean. Just a reminder of how important those connections are.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.